He defines this concept in the following way, and I quote, "Abject cosmopolitanism does not aim for a higher ground so much as to burrow into the apparatuses and technologies of exclusion in order to disrupt the administrative routines, the day-to-day perceptions and constructions of normality." Nayers links these disruptions to asylum seekers and refugees. There may be ways to explore the complexities of vernacular cosmopolitanism in horizontal relations, for instance, in South-South networking or the global collaborations of indigenous groups who are quite aware that they are caught up within hierarchies and exclusionary concepts of modernity. Such an approach is captured in Stuart Hall's plea for what he terms an agnostic democratic process, and I quote from him, "We witness the situation of communities that are not simply isolated, atomistic individuals, nor are they well-bounded, singular, separate communities. We are in that open space that requires a kind of vernacular cosmopolitanism, that is to say, a cosmopolitanism that is aware of the limitations of any one culture or any one identity, and that is radically aware of its insufficiency in governing a wider society, but which, nevertheless, is not prepared to rescind its claims to the traces of difference which makes its life important." Acknowledging these traces of difference without their adding up to a master narrative is the stake here. Elsewhere, I've referred to the process of suggesting differences without producing comprehensive answers as a stammering pedagogy. Certainly within my own work, the question of being at the periphery, on the margins, at odds with, at a slant to prevailing orthodoxies has always been paramount, not least for the reason that it allows one to be ambushed by estrangement, the unexpected perspective that reveals something new within one's own familiar iterations and taxonomies. But let me examine the ways in which these claims resonate with other theorists. In debates on cosmopolitanism, much revolves around the tendency to view universal human rights as being at odds with the sovereignty of nation-states, and Immanuel Kant, for example, is often invoked by both sides of the argument. Sheila Ben Habib, in her book Another Cosmopolitanism, argues that Kant's significance lies not so much in his doctrine of hospitality as in the ways in which his 3 articles on definitive peace are articulated together. In consequence, to quote her, the discourse of hospitality moves from the language of morals to that of juridical rights. Legal cosmopolitanism, according to which the individual is not only a moral being who is a member of a universal moral community, but is also a person entitled to a certain status in a world civil society. In Derrida's interpretation, there is recognition that hospitality is always permeated by hostility. Hence, his neologism, hostipitality. Yes? While Ben Habib recognizes the claims of the state and the fact that we act politically from within bounded communities, these, to quote her, state borders and frontiers require moral justification. And in this dance, she reminds us that, to quote her, every iteration transforms meaning. Furthermore, when it comes to articulating the democratic people in relation to the nation, those who are excluded from the nation are not able to participate in legislation concerning human rights. To cite her, citizenship and naturalization are sites where the disjunctions between nationhood and democratic peoplehood become most apparent. From this, her argument is that naturalized European Union citizens should have the same rights as all other European Union citizens. In her vision of a cosmopolitanism to come, Ben Habib reinforces the need for solidarities beyond borders and the recognition of universal rights to hospitality. For example, there's a very powerful organization of people in North America, Canada, and the USA called No People Are Illegal. So it's this idea that borders, in a sense, transgress the notion that everyone has a moral right to be in a place to hospitality. Okay. Paul Gilroy, channeling Montesquieu in After Empire, his book called After Empire, argues for a type of conviviality that recognizes that we need to find ways of living in and with difference in a divided but also convergent planet, as he puts it. Scrutinizing the politics of power, Gilroy notes Giorgio Agamben's stark contention that the camp has replaced the city as, quote, the primary political institution of our anxious age. I would agree and add that the camp is also within the city, or as others such as Anne McClintock have argued, the city also includes such abject zones. For example, I live in Vancouver, which recently became a world center because it was the site for the Winter Olympics. Okay. And it was, it's often cited as being one of the global cities, most livable cities. It's up there. And it is a very pleasant place. But there is, in the downtown east side, at the center of Vancouver, the city, is the place where the homeless converge. And many are ostracized, and many are Aboriginal. Right? And it reveals the underpinnings of what is behind this facade of Vancouver as the most wonderful kind of global city in the world, and it's most hospitable. And as always with these Olympics, these kinds of sites are cleared before the visitors come in. I'm sure you have your own examples. Invoking race as the way to make visible some of the ruling agendas, Gilroy rightly draws our attention to the fact that to cite him, foundational investment that the West has made in the idea of rights is not itself a neutral or universal gesture. Ernesto Laclau has raised similar arguments when he suggests that the problems begin when a group claims to inhabit or incorporate universalism. Gilroy rightly critiques some versions of the new cosmopolitanism, preferring what he terms demotic cosmopolitanism, which involves, to cite him, the principled and methodical cultivation of a degree of estrangement from one's own culture and history. I'd like to extend this idea to include considerations of estrangement as pedagogy, since it is precisely something that is cultivated, something one must learn, as distinct from race or even class attributes thrust upon one. And it is a feature I discern in many of the writers I examine: Dubravka Ugresic, Herta Müller, Antigone Kavala. Gilroy suggests that imagining oneself as a stranger might instructively be linked to actually becoming estranged from the cultural habits one was born into, and he cites the example of George Orwell within colonial England. However, as I'll argue, this imagining is different from being interpolated as stranger in what one considers to be one's home. Herta Müller's Swabian Germans in Romania, non-Anglo-Celts in Australia, those outside the Anglophone-Francophone axis in Canada. Gilroy's argument also calls to mind Kristeva's influential text, Strangers to Ourselves, which many have called to task for its lack of historical specificity. In response, I'd argue that the structures of psychoanalysis that Kristeva invokes work quite well when applied to specific periods and places. For example, her timely reminder that cosmopolitanism can be either libertarian or totalitarian. Gilroy's book offers a revised account of European modernism in which black and brown Europeans are part of its fabric rather than being eternally regarded as aberrations. My addendum is that black and brown are not natural categories, but are historically given content, and those designated by these terms were not always necessarily perceived as aberrant. For example, that position is currently thrust upon Muslims, and it has traditionally, and still to some degree is, occupied by so-called Eastern Europeans who are perceived as visible carriers of Oriental so-called contaminations. In other words, the mechanisms of racialization as tracked by Gilroy extend to many groups. So this next part is called Allegories of Cosmopolitanism. And my subtitle deliberately echoes Frederick Jameson's much critiqued essay from the mid-80s, Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism, where he argues that all Third World texts necessarily function as national allegories. I'll be suggesting that many contemporary texts dealing with Eastern Europe are read as, and to some degrees written as, allegories of post-national cosmopolitanism in both their utopian and dystopian variants. For those who view with suspicion the claims that cultural texts may be analyzed for their emancipatory or subversive possibilities, for example, one encounters this skepticism in the critiques of Homi Bhabha's work. What has textual complexity to do with political complexity? That's the sort of argument that's made. My suggestion is that many claims are anchored in identifying the material or embodied, are usually based on narratives, including fictional ones. The ability to educate us in the many dimensions of narratology surely includes cultural texts. In addition, it is short-sighted to deny writers or artists the right to offer their own analyses of relations of sociality and their affective dimensions. Such analyses may differ in the degrees of their reflexivity, but are clearly part of the repertoire we have of imagining otherwise, or, as I argued earlier, being open to the kinds of estrangement that allows us to interpret otherwise. Affectivity is similarly notoriously elusive to analysis, but is surely not, as we see from the many debates on affect, to be ignored. Is there this sort of debate here as well, notions of affect, emotions, and so on, and feelings? This has been an explosion in the sort of transatlantic critical community, that people are beginning to talk about the importance, the critical and conceptual importance of the emotions and affect. We might return to that. So I'm very interested in it. It is equally important to rescue the analysis of affectivity from mysticism and religion. In this section, I'll examine the cultural texts of cosmopolitanism, those explorations in sociality and hospitality that juxtapose claims to humanity with the constraints of subaltern abjection, with the caution I mentioned earlier. Imagining the stranger differs from imagining oneself as stranger and from being interpolated as stranger in the place one considers home. So I start with the first section, imagining the stranger. In preparation for this talk, I was reading, perversely perhaps, a British novelist called Olivia Manning and her Balkan trilogy, which was first published in 1960. There's also been a film series made of this that's interesting to see, with Emma Thompson. The trilogy explores the adventures of a group of young British cosmopolitans in the old meaning of a certain class of world traveller, associated with the so-called soft diplomacy of the British Council in the Balkans in the early days of the Second World War. Olivia Manning skillfully exposes both their sense of an entitlement that is undergirded by a firm belief in their own modernity and their access to a civilized subjectivity based on the right to designate others as beyond the pale, in this case, that very territory of the Balkans. Here is a characteristic passage which is set in Bucharest, in Romania, and I quote, I hope this comes across. A peasant had brought a handcart laden with melons into the town and tipped them out at the park gate. Repelled by their profusion, she had an odd fancy that gathered there in a flashing mass of yellow and gold, the melons were not really inert, but hiding a pullulating craftiness that might, if unchecked, one day take over the world. This is meloni, right? But these melons hid within themselves this terrible kind of contagion which might one day take over the world. It's an extraordinary passage. There it is.